This
the recording.
conference will now be recorded.
Okay, we are being recorded now. So, Jill, over to you. I am just going to make you the presenter.
And I'm hoping that that's going to change the view that I have on my screen, because I don't seem to have the share my screen option available to me, and I did have yesterday. Let me just try that button there, and then try this, and I can no longer see the controls for GoToMeeting, Gunjan, but I'm hoping that everybody can now see my screen. Is that right?
Well, you are the new presenter, so but I can't see your screen yet.
I'm hoping that it should pick up now.
See it. I see it.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so Gunjan, thank you for your very generous introduction. I'm not going to pause and talk more about my background, but I do want to just mention that I haven't been in research and evaluation all my life. I worked in human services until my early 50s, and have moved over to research and evaluation in the last part of my career. And my interest is very much about how do we support and enable people who are trying to do good things but difficult things in good causes. How do we support people to understand whether and how what they're doing is achieving what it is that they think it's achieving, and how to improve it if it's not. And so by great good fortune, at about the time as I was getting really interested in how do we do evaluation better from a field perspective, two guys came along and wrote the first book that got this whole realist approaches movement going, and it's their work that I'm primarily going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk in three sections. The first section is to very quickly introduce some of the fundamental principles that underpin realist approaches. Then I'm going to talk very quickly about realist evaluation and very quickly about realist review. But in each case, the way I'm actually going to try and demonstrate what it's about is to talk you through an evaluation in the first case and a review in the second case, so that you can see a little bit about what it can look like. They are, of course, only examples, and there are lots of different ways of doing the things that we're going to talk about. I've been forewarned that some people on the call don't necessarily have a background in research and evaluation. So we just need to start by recognizing that, first of all, there are a whole range of different kinds of research and evaluation. And each of the different approaches make different assumptions about things like, well, what is the nature of reality and what can we know about reality? And if we're doing things to try and cause things, well, actually, how does causation work? And different approaches are better suited to different purposes as well. Some are better for accountability, some are better for learning, some are better for supporting decision making. Each approach asks different kinds of questions. Some questions are about, did they do what they said they were going to do? Some questions are about how or why, or does this work or not? And some questions are about what should we do next? So the different purposes and assumptions and questions then feed into an enormously wide range of different kinds of research designs. The three examples on your screen at the moment are only a very, very short set of samples. There's lots of others. And they use different methods, and they provide different kinds of answers, and they also take different approaches to how it is that you actually learn across different kinds of research and evaluation. And we call that cumulation across different kinds of research and evaluation. I mentioned that there were two guys who started all this work. It's a dreadful picture of Ray because it's taken from it's a still from a short video that he did. But these are Pawson and Tilley, Ray Pawson from Leeds University and Nick Tilley, now from University College London, but previously from Nottingham Trent. And they are both sociologists. Nick is a criminologist. Ray has been a sociologist of health and of education. And they got together and started to think about how is it that you would apply realist philosophy in evaluation. And they wrote 3 books so far. The first one they wrote together, and that's Realistic Evaluation. That's the book that started it all. Ray then went forward and wrote a book about realist review, and he has since come back and written a 3rd book, which is it's primarily about the science of evaluation and the accumulation question. They're fabulous books, and I heartily recommend that anybody who's interested in pursuing the methods actually does go back and read the books. But today we'll try and pull out just a few very key ideas, and I want to start with a couple of definitions. So when we talk about evaluation, we're talking about what's called in the field, or called in the domain, primary research. We're going out and we're collecting data, and that data is designed to be collected in systematic ways and to enable us to make judgments about the program. So that's judgments about what outcomes are we actually achieving. It's judgments about the merit, the worth, the significance of what it is that we're achieving. But in realist evaluation, it's also judgments about how and why things do and don't work and why they work differently in different contexts. So that's what evaluation is. Realist review is also known as realist synthesis. They're the same, 2 names for the same thing. And that's the realist approach to literature review. But it can also include other kinds of data, which we'll talk about a bit more later. And then realist research is any other form of research that isn't realist evaluation, and it's not a realist review, but it's based in the same assumptions that underpin realist evaluation and realist review. Second set of definitions about this word realist. Originally, it was a play on words. Nick and Ray both have very dry British sense of humour. And so it was intended to be this kind of triple level of meaning. First of all, it's real in the sense that it's dealing with things that are going on in the real world. It's realist in the sense that it is grounded in what they at that point in time were calling scientific realism. They don't use that phrase anymore. But realism is a philosophy of science, and we're going to talk a little bit about its key assumptions. And the third play on words was that as well as being realist, it would be realistic. It's intended to be applied research, which is pursued to inform the thinking of, and those words are important. It's not making decisions for people, it's providing data and evidence that policymakers and practitioners, participants and the public can use to make decisions about policies and programs, interventions. And the third thing to say for those of you who are working in the field is that there are differences between various different kinds of realism. The 2 that you hear most about are critical realism and then Pawson and Tilley's approach that you hear most about in evaluation anyway. They have common understandings of the underlying philosophy, but they take slightly different values positions. We don't have time to go into that today, but I'm happy to answer questions if people are interested, maybe by email later. So when we start to think about why it was that Pawson and Tilley got stuck into this work, they were both working in research and evaluation, and they knew that the same programs almost always get different outcomes for different subgroups of participants and or in different contexts and cultures. They knew that even when your results are positive on average, that includes almost always negative outcomes for some people for some kinds of outcomes. Even when the results are positive on average, we don't actually necessarily know why. There are quite a lot of programs that do achieve what people think they're intended to achieve, but they don't work for the reasons that the people who are running them think they work. And one of the things that then happens is that you try and pick up and replicate the program, and actually you don't know what it is about it that works, so you don't know how to replicate it elsewhere. And the other thing that they knew was that even when they're not supposed to, even when you're trying to run a high fidelity trial, program staff actually usually do adapt the program. And what they're trying to do is to make it work in their particular context, usually. But sometimes in the process of adapting it, it changes whether and how and for whom it works. So there's this set of, well, how do policy workers or practitioners on the ground use research and evaluation findings when they've got all these different difficulties about the nature of the evidence that they provide and how useful that is in practice. Come on screen, go forward. So what I want to do now is just talk very briefly about some of the principles that underpin realist approaches. And the first one is that realists believe that there is a real world, and the real world is there independent of or interdependent with our interpretations of it. And that position is not shared by all philosophies or all research methods. So the second assumption that is built into a realist approach is it's not just the material world that is real, the social world is real. You can't see most aspects of a social world, but it's nonetheless real for a realist, and we know that it's real because it can have real effects. So things like gender as distinct from sex. Gender is real even though you can't see it, it's a social construction. But we know that it's real because it has real effects. Class is real, culture is real, and so forth. The next major assumption is systems theory. Trying to summarize systems theory in a line or two is impossible, but it's important to realize that systems are stratified. They have different levels and different elements are embedded within different parts of social systems, but they're also open. And that means that things can move in and out of them. All kinds of things can move in and out of them. They can evolve, and they evolve because different levels and different structures within the system and different objects and different events are all interacting all the time, which is, you know, kind of ho-hum. Yes, we all know that. But what it means in terms of causation, which of course we're really interested in evaluation, we want to know whether or not our programs are causing any change in the circumstances that we're trying to change. So it means that there are many causes of any event. There are lots of things going on in that system that are contributing to the pattern of outcomes that you see. And it also means that any event or anything that we do may have many different consequences in many levels of systems and in different types of systems. You can be operating to try and improve health and have outcomes in education or whatever it might be. When you translate those basic assumptions about the nature of reality over to programs, and I'm using the word programs in a general sense, programs, policies, interventions, whatever, it means that policies and programs are real. And we know that they're real because they can have real effects. Social programs, any kind of program that is trying to change circumstances for people, what people do, how people behave, any of those sorts of things. Social programs are all social systems. And that means that they're embedded into the contexts that they're working in. And it also means that they're open systems, they're not closed. Things affect them and they affect things. Next assumption is that all programs are an attempt to create, or in fact to steer, change. Now we say to steer change because there's change happening all the time. But what programs are trying to do is influence the nature or direction of that change. The next assumption is that programs are theories incarnate, theories made real. And by theories at that level, we just mean a set of assumptions and beliefs about what it is that we're going to do. So there's a theory of action and why it is that we think that's going to work, a theory of change. And the idea is that for realists and for all other forms of theory-based evaluation, part of the job of the evaluation is to work out what those theories and assumptions are and then test them and then refine them. And the example that I'm going to give for realist evaluation in a few minutes, I'm going to focus very much on that testing and refining program theories bit more than on the outcomes of the particular program. And the final assumption is because programs are embedded in the context in which they work, those contexts do make a difference to the outcomes that are generated and to how the programs themselves work. So we can't evaluate programs separately from or in isolation from the context in which they work. The contexts are in fact contributing to the outcomes. So there's kind of three key ideas that are built in, particularly to the idea of, to the nature of causation, the understanding of causation that realists have. And these three key ideas we know by the key words: context, mechanism, and outcome. And just to give a very simple description of what we mean by those, I want you to imagine that I have in my hand a tennis ball, and I'm holding my hand parallel to the ground, and I'm on planet Earth. In fact, very conveniently, in the first photograph, I'm on a tennis court. When I open my hand, the ball falls to the ground. Now, if we stop and ask why the ball falls to the ground, me opening my hand was a necessary but not sufficient condition for the ball to fall to the ground. What made it fall to the ground was gravity. If I was in outer space at the when I opened my hand, in the first instance, the ball wouldn't move. If I could open my hand in such a way as to exert no pressure on the ball wouldn't do anything. It would just stay where it is. And then after a while, it would start to float away. And the reason for that is that the gravitational force exerted by my body is actually greater than the gravitational force exerted by anything else that's out there in outer space. And then other forces would start to work on it. But in effect, we talk as though there is no gravity in outer space. And so I've done the same thing. I've opened my hand, but we get a different outcome. In the third context, if I happen to be underwater at the time that I open my hand, the ball would rise. And that's because the force we call buoyancy is stronger underwater than the force that we call gravity. Now, the moral of the story here is that me opening my hand is an analogy for program activity or program strategies, the things that programs do. And you can do exactly the same things in different contexts and you get different results. The reasons that you get different results is that there are different underlying causal forces, and we use the word mechanism to describe those, which are operating and which operate differently in different contexts. So for realists, context affects whether and which underlying causal processes actually operate and how strongly they operate, and therefore that changes the nature of the outcomes that we get. We do the same things, but different mechanisms fire and cause in different contexts and cause different outcomes. So context, mechanism, outcome becomes a little short heuristic, a little thing that we can use as a memory trick to remember what it is that we have to be exploring and explaining through our evaluations. When you translate those key ideas across to programs, we see at the top level of this diagram that the program activities themselves are not mechanisms. The program activities are me opening my hand and letting go of the tennis ball. But programs are doing something, and they do contribute to the change that is caused. So what is it that they are doing, and how do they work? So the key idea in realist evaluation is that programs are providing some kind of change in the context. They're providing some kind of new resource for people, or new opportunities that they didn't have before, or they might be changing the constraints that affect people. And those changes in resources or opportunities or constraints somehow affect the reasoning, the preferences, the norms, the collective beliefs, the things inside people's heads that then result in different decisions and choices. And it's those different decisions and choices that actually cause program outcomes. Now, of course, different people respond to different parts of what is provided by programs, and they respond in different ways to the things that are provided. And so that helps to explain why it is that you get different outcomes for different groups of people, even though you're providing the same opportunities. So that passage of the interaction between resource and reasoning for different groups of people, we know as a program mechanism. So we talk in shorthand about reasoning and resources. So this slide is a quick example of some of the different mechanisms that might fire if you run any kind of media campaign with a health message. Don't smoke, don't eat as much sugar, drink more water, take more exercise, grow healthy veggies on your lot at home. Now, that message might work in very different ways. It might be that the people you intend to hear the message actually do hear it. That's step one. And they believe what they've heard, and they prioritize it over other things, and they act as they are intended to act, and therefore health risks are minimized. Or it might be that intended targets actually don't believe that they're at risk from whatever the health risk is, and they dispute that message and they undermine it with the people who are also at risk. That actually happened with HIV/AIDS campaigns early on. People simply didn't believe that you could catch HIV by sharing needles, for example, and they undermined that message with other people who were also sharing needles. Or it might be that the people who hear it are the worried well, and they become more worried and they visit their health services, which means that there's fewer resources left for those who actually need them, and overall health declines. Or maybe what happens is that teachers believe the message and they start teaching it to children who act on it as they get older. So you see long-term impacts, but you don't see any short-term impacts from your campaign. Or maybe what happens is that employers hear the message and they think that their business is at risk from whoever the target group is, and they discriminate against those and don't employ them. Well, unemployment is a health hazard. So that changes health outcomes for the at-risk group in its own right. Or maybe what happens is that health workers hear the message, they believe it, they change their priorities, they add their services, they add different services, and it's actually the nature of the services available that influences the change in health outcomes. Now, depending on which of those mechanisms fire for more of those subgroups and how strongly they fire, that might change the patterns of outcomes. But if what it is that is actually causing the change in health behaviours is not just directly the intended targets hearing it and believing it, then picking up that message and repeating it elsewhere won't necessarily work elsewhere. But the other important key thing to notice here is that if you've got those different mechanisms firing, then you need different data to actually test which of those are happening, and therefore, and how much they are contributing to the pattern of outcomes that you see. So the message is the program activity, in the middle, the media campaign, but that might work in quite different ways with different groups of people and contribute to different patterns of outcomes. So in the middle of this next slide, we're adding context. So as I said before, aspects of context affect which mechanisms operate. We've still got the mechanisms in the middle of this slide, but now we've got a whole bunch of other things that are affecting which mechanisms fire. It might be things about the way the program is run. So things about the way the program is implemented that affect which mechanisms fire. It might be things about the individuals, their culture, their gender, the resources they have available to them, their personal history that affect how they respond to the resources that the program offers. There might be things about the local context. It might be about politics or culture or economics or the level of stability as compared to the level of violence that influences how people respond. All these different, it might be about the relationships between workers and targets. That often has something to do with how programs work. And so all these different things also then feed into the bigger picture about whether or not the resources and opportunities are available for people to act on the decision they would like to make, even if they want to make the decision that you want them to make. Can they in fact put that into practice? And so all these different aspects of context will have different levels of effect on the mechanisms that operate or don't, and therefore contribute to developing patterns of program outcomes. Realists are really not all that much interested in the average outcome or the effect size. We do want to know that because we want to know whether programs are effective overall, but we're much more interested in knowing who it's working for and how it's working, because that is the information that enables you to target and to tailor your programs so that they have the best chance of being effective in the context in which you need to work. And this idea of we actually want to understand this program, not just report its average effect, leads to the structure of realist questions as they turn up in evaluations and reviews. And the basic structure of the realist question is down the left-hand side of this slide. We don't just ask, does it work? We ask, for whom does it work? Now, that is not asking who are the target groups for this program. It's asking within the target groups, which subgroups is it working for better and worse? And remembering that for some people, it's actually probably causing negative impacts. We ask for whom in what contexts. So what is it about the context, about the circumstances or the situations that affects whether the intended mechanisms operate and whether other mechanisms operate as well? The in what respects and to what extent questions are actually outcomes questions. Most programs have multiple different kinds of outcomes, and they might be different types of outcomes for different groups in different contexts, but they might also be to different extents for different groups in different contexts. And the final question is how? How do they actually work? And there we are talking about the program mechanisms idea, not just the program activities. You may well need to track whether or not program activities have been conducted and whether they were conducted in the ways that were intended. But that is in order to be able to understand whether and which mechanisms have actually operated. So I will pause there very briefly because we're going to, I know already that we're going to run short of time, but if there are any particular urgent questions before we move forward, I'll take a minute to answer them now. Gunjan, I can't see questions. If there's any on the screen, perhaps you might be able to give me a quick heads up.
Yeah, Jill, Joseph had a question, and I mean, you can tackle it either now or later if we have time. He said that when Pawson and Tilly say programs are theories incarnate, do they assume that programs have internal consistency like a theory?
No, they don't. There is usually an overarching theory that most people agree is, roughly speaking, how this is supposed to work. The program theory, I talk in terms of the program's theory of itself, but in fact, when you start to break that down, different stakeholders within a program might have different ideas of how it's working. And one of the things that evaluations often do is test whether or not those different internal theories are competing theories are correct. So we talk about adjudicating between competing theories. The other thing to say is that one overarching theory might have many, very many sub-theories, and so you can investigate different levels and different types of theory within a single evaluation, and that will show up in the example that I'm going to use in a minute.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions on the chat. If anybody has a question that they want to ask, please speak up. Otherwise, otherwise Jill will move ahead. Thank you.
Okay, feel free to add questions into the chat box as we move through the next one. I'm now going to give us our quick realist evaluation example. And remembering that realist evaluation is designed to improve our understanding of how and why whatever it is that we're evaluating works or doesn't in particular contexts. We're trying to understand how and why it works and why that varies. So we might use realist evaluation for evaluating programs that have got mixed patterns of outcomes in order to understand how and why the differences occur. That's the most common use. And the differences might be for different groups within the same sites, or it might be that we're looking at different outcomes in different sites or different cultures or different overall contexts, which I normally refer to as settings. It's used for programs that seem to work, but we don't actually know for whom it's working, and we don't know why it's working differently for different groups. It's used for new initiatives, for pilot programs and trials. And it's also often used for evaluating programs that will be scaled out, because we need to be able to understand how to adapt the intervention to new contexts or new situations. On this next slide, the left-hand column shows a very quick and dirty, superficial kind of summary of the process of evaluation design. And the right-hand side of the table shows how that manifests in a realist evaluation. So whenever you're designing an evaluation, you need to work out what its purpose is. So for realist evaluations, the purpose is always to increase understanding in order to inform decision making. Once you know what the purpose of an evaluation is, you can write your key overarching evaluation questions. For a realist evaluation, those are always going to be realist questions: for whom, in what context, how, etc., etc. For any kind of theory-based evaluation, the next step is to develop your understanding of what the program theory is. How is it that people expect that this program is going to work? When you're doing that in a realist evaluation, you develop your program theory, at least in part, not always at the beginning, but always by the end, in the terms of context, mechanism, outcome statements. They're propositions at the beginning, bits of theory that we want to test, and they're refined by the end of the evaluation. Once you know your purpose, your questions, and your program theory, then you can start to think about what's the best methodology and design to answer these particular questions. In realist evaluations, your design is built to test and refine your theory, and where necessary, adjudicate between theories. Once you know your methodology and design, you can select your methods. Are they going to be quant? Are they going to be qual? How are you actually going to collect your data? Realist evaluations are designed to be mixed method, and there are ways you need to adapt different approaches to make them compatible with the realist approach. But on a broad level, realist evaluation doesn't actually require you to use any particular approach. Once you know your methods, you can develop your instruments. That's things like your surveys or your interview schedules or whatever it is. It is entirely possible to use existing validated instruments within realist evaluation, but they often don't get at the questions that we're interested in, particularly questions about mechanisms. So we might need to have purpose-designed instruments. Once you know what your instruments are going to be, then you have to have ways of collecting the data and recording it, and you have to do that in particular ways that I'm not going to go into today in order to enable you to do the analysis of for whom, in what context, and how and why. Once you've got your data collected and it's recorded, then you can analyze it. The analysis in realist evaluation is usually within the program, so we call it intra-program, but it's across context, so inter-context. And what you're doing is analyzing your data according to the theory, so that you can test and refine your theory. And then once you've done your analysis, you can report. You need to report a realist evaluation in ways that are consistent with the work that you've just done. So you can't, for example, say, we found this fabulously varied pattern of outcomes, so everybody do X. We've seen that remarkably frequently in realist evaluations. Your recommendations have to be nuanced and tailored to context. And you always have to include your refined theory in your evaluation reports. There are standards and guidelines for how to report realist evaluation that are available for free on the net, and we can talk about those later. So now I'm going to whiz through an example, and I'm not going to talk in detail about any of the all of these slides because there's far too much information and it would take too long. But basically, this is an evaluation of a citizen voice and action program, which is a program run by World Vision. It's a social accountability program which is intended to influence whether services and governments provide the services to which residents are entitled. And it works by developing relationships, developing and providing accurate information about rights and entitlements, educating residents, service providers and officials about those rights. They often don't know. And then working with the service providers and the communities to develop ways to monitor whether or not services actually do meet standards and citizen standards as well. And where they don't, developing plans to improve the quality and accessibility of services, and then repeat the process annually in order to check whether or not you're making progress and update the plans. This evaluation in particular was conducted through Wahana Visi, World Vision Indonesia. It was health related, maternal and infant health, 4-year concurrent evaluation of a program operating in 3 provinces with and including 60 villages, and working quite significantly through the staff and volunteers who, this was a collaborative evaluation, and the staff and them did all the actual data collection. What were we trying to achieve? What was the purpose? Well, we did want to know what the outcomes of the program were within the time frame of the project, but World Vision wanted to be able to refine CVA by understanding how it worked. And this was also a capacity building evaluation. We were building the capacity of Wahana Visi to undertake realist evaluation. And so we had a series of realist questions about the outcomes, how and why they vary, in what contexts they work, what are the features of context that matter. And there was a particular set of questions around participation and what participation is required in order for the program to be effective. World Vision uses a much simpler picture than this, but this is the theory of action that we developed at the beginning of the evaluation to try and understand what it was that was expected to be done in the program, and then a kind of hierarchy of outcomes of how what was expected to be done was supposed to contribute to a series of intermediate outcomes that would then contribute to the intended overall outcome of improving maternal and child health. You can look at that at your leisure later. I can make these slides available for anybody who wants them, by the way. So that was the theory of action, but what was the theory of change? So here we identified 8 main mechanisms that we expected all needed to fire, all needed to operate if the program was going to actually result in continuous improvement in health services, which in turn would contribute to improved health outcomes. And I'm not going to talk about all of them now, but the most fundamental assumption in most social accountability programs is if you give people information about their rights and a way of assessing whether or not those rights are being met, that's going to make them aware of the gap between their rights and what they're actually getting, and that's going to motivate their engagement. And so I will talk a little bit more about that one later on in this presentation. But the key moral of the story here, for most programs, you would expect multiple mechanisms to need to fire in order for the program to be effective. As well as developing those 8 main mechanisms, we wrote more detailed program theory mechanisms in the context mechanism outcome form and at a lower level of detail. So here we are assuming that there is a low level of awareness of service standards at the village level. What's the intended mechanism? So CVA is providing simplified information through accessible media. That's the resource part. The reasoning part of the mechanism. Posyandu cadres and service users develop an increased understanding. It's inside their heads. We can't see it, but it's understanding of what they're expected to be providing, and they become aware that what is being provided doesn't meet the standards. Next part of the reasoning, because parents and cadres want the best for their children, note that is not actually part of the program or program theory, it's just a circumstance that already exists. Parents love their kids and they want the best for their kids. They want the services to meet the standards and they're therefore motivated to participate in the program. And the immediate outcome of that is that the volunteers and the service users do participate in the processes of the program. Also on that slide, you can see that we identified for each of these more detailed CMOs, the data sources, those are listed along the bottom of the slide, and the kinds of analyses that we would use for the particular indicators that we were collecting. And we did that for each of, actually we did it for a lot, but then we selected 14 of those that we would try and test. What data did we have? Well, we had standards monitoring data that was collected and provided by and analysed by the service staff themselves in order to answer the questions, do services meet government standards? How and why, in what ways and where? We also had citizen report cards, which dealt with citizen satisfaction and how that varied. We had a household survey that was about the knowledge and information issues about services and rights. We had a mirroring survey of the same type for officials and cadres. By the way, they don't always know, often don't know what their rights and entitlements are. And then we had a modified form of most significant change stories that we ran in 24 of the 60 villages, in which we were collecting qualitative data about the outcomes that people thought were a result of the program, which of those outcomes they thought were most significant, and how they thought they came about. And we did some little mini case studies about running most significant change stories in what we thought were high and low performing villages, but which turned out to be different than we had assumed. And then we also had access to all the process monitoring data that was being collected by World Vision in order to report to the World Bank. We did many different kinds of analyses of this fabulously rich data set. We looked at change over time. We disaggregated that by the 3 districts, by respondent types, and by the point in time at which villages came into the program. We looked at patterns of outcomes. We analysed the data to refine our context mechanism outcome statements. And we also then stood back from our patterns of outcomes and refined CMOs to develop a kind of more middle range, higher level theory about how CVA works. And that was being reported in multiple ways over the course of this 4-year evaluation. We had an evaluation design, a baseline study, annual reports, and a final report. And World Vision, meanwhile, was looking after the accountability reporting to the World Bank against their required log frame. Now, I'm not going to go into the outcomes patterns in any detail because we don't have time, but the program did result in improved performance against the standards. That was things like number of midwives employed, whether or not the villages had the necessary equipment, and so forth. But we did see variations in the level of attainment for different levels of health centres in different districts and for different standards. We did see improved satisfaction with services across the program on average, but again, lots of variations within that, and there were some aspects of satisfaction that did not improve. We did see improved knowledge of the services available and of rights, but actually not improved knowledge of some particular services that are critical to improving maternal and child health. And so we were able to say, you really need to beef up the information provision in relation to these particular services. Because if people don't know about that, you're going to continue to have problems. In addition to that, the most significant change stories enabled us to identify a whole range of different kinds of outcomes that were identified in relation to service access, quality, child health, maternal health. They weren't expecting to measure those within the period of the program, but we identified some outcomes anyway. Child development, participation and empowerment, stronger communities, communities' views for their future, and a bunch of other things as well. But we are going to focus on this idea of refining the understanding of how the program works. So we started off with this theory that if people are aware of the gap between their entitlements and their current services, that would motivate citizens to participate. Actually, that wasn't how it worked, really. What actually happened was that there was increased confidence to speak up. And the increased awareness was part of that, but it was actually the having collective processes with World Vision standing alongside communities that enabled them to be confident to speak up about what the gaps were. We had this idea that social accountability holds governments and service providers to account, but what we discovered was that what actually social accountability programs do is that they trigger, or this program did, was trigger internal accountability systems within the health services, and that also changed the way that resources were allocated within the health systems, which then changed the nature of the services that were available. And we had a theory that service leaders were going to be activated. Well, they were, but as well as service leaders, so were locally elected officials and community leaders. And most importantly, there were stronger relationships and stronger collaboration between those leaders, all of whom had been active in the past, or many of whom had been active in the past, but they were now able to act together. And when we stood back a little bit from our much refined and many of refined CMOs, we were able to say that actually CVA works in 2 different ways. First is that it changes the nature of power relationships. And I'm not going to talk through this whole slide because it's far too detailed to summarise in the time that we've got. But some of the key ideas here is that using standards and scorecards makes the criteria for judgment transparent, and that enables people to talk. But it also informs leaders about what's going on out there. They often don't actually know. Using collective processes that are structured and transparent and participatory organises collective opinion. And from the service and political point of view, that's a whole lot harder to dismiss than individual opinions. And politically, the services loved it because it meant that the politicians couldn't dismiss their claims for increased resources as just being about service self-interest. The use of government standards provided a direct relationship to government policy, and that works by legitimating the claims that are being made. And involving multiple kinds of authorities meant that multiple types of authority and resources could be brought to bear. So overall, the CVA changed power relationships by triggering internal accountabilities and enabling authorities to take action to address the gaps. The other way that it really worked was by strengthening systems. And I'm going to do even less talking about this. But what it did was bring citizens inside the system so that they became part of the decision-making process. It changed who was providing what information so that citizens were more aware. It brought resources in from different sources, including local government, which meant that there were more resources available. And it structured cooperation and collaboration across different parts of the system so that everybody was contributing to the same processes, to the same goals, I mean, overall. So I know that was very rushed, but we will pause just briefly here for any quick questions if people have them.
Frank had a comment. Frank, do you want to mention that? And if anybody has any questions, please unmute yourselves and.
Yeah, I got a question also. This is Frank from Cooperative Capacity Partners. Spent a lot of time in Indonesia, so I know the Posyandu and the health system well. And my experience has been that government officials, especially in health, many of them want to do well. So any opportunity they get to see how to do better, they'll grab it. And that sort of assumption didn't seem to be inherent in the original design.
No, it's one of the contextual differences that can play out. I mean, there was an awful lot that was going on in Indonesia that was going to enable and support this. I think there are a lot of humans with good intent, and that they do the kind of job they do because they would like to be useful, and they think that the issue is important. So that's actually very common. There was also a whole lot that was going on about democratization and decentralization of resources and a whole lot of other stuff that enabled the program to achieve the results that it did, and that I haven't shown in this very quick presentation. But if you have got government that are not on side, or service providers who are not on side, then the processes do change, and so do the underpinning mechanisms.
Absolutely. My question, though, is you're looking at the program, but a part of how well a program succeeds is based on the theory of the program, but also how it's implemented. You can have a great theory, but if the implementing agency is a disaster, you can't. How do you break out the quality of implementation or the standard of implementation versus how that affects the results?
Yeah, it was covered in the monitoring to some extent in this evaluation. You usually find out pretty early on if some of the implementation is not working as intended. And so you can then sort of swing the focus of the evaluation in to look at what is it about the implementation that matters for firing the later mechanisms and contributing to the outcomes. And you can develop your theories in relation to the implementation itself. So it's just a focus of which aspects of the program theory you focus on.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question, if I may. Jill?
Yeah, go.
Hi, this is Tessa from Relief International. Really interesting presentation and an excellent introduction for me personally. But wondering, from what I'm hearing with realist evaluations being so embedded in a given context and understanding that many things are not transferable outside of the constraints of a certain context or the enabling factors within a certain context, what sort of lessons can really be drawn from the Indonesia evaluation that, like, what do you think can be drawn from that and applied to other contexts, given the fact that everything is so context dependent, and that's such an important tenet of realist approaches?
Yeah. It's all to do with the level of abstraction. So once you worked out how and why something works where it does in the first, context, you then examine the second context to say, are these things portable, or do we see these same features of context over in this new context? So it might be that in the new context, you don't actually have posyandu, which are local health services, largely volunteer run, only run one session a month in a village. Maybe those things don't exist in the new context that you're going to. But you examine what it is that exists and what it is about the way that the services are provided that is expected to operate as you translate this across. I've been really surprised, I have to say, by the high-level policy responses that we have seen to this particular evaluation, and they're responding to the last two slides, the abstracted theory about how these programs work. So we've said, the World Bank has said things like, this is going to change the way we do evaluation of social accountability from here on in. The program theory has been picked up and is being tested in a different World Vision evaluation in Bangladesh. The Indonesian government is looking more at how do they build social accountability processes into some particular policies and programs. And some of the local decision makers, so village heads and heads of district health picked up aspects of the service and of the program and built it into the way that they operate on an ongoing basis. So this idea that by learning how and why things work, that can actually increase the impacts at the local level at the same time as you take the abstracted ideas about what it is about the circumstances that matter to whether this works, and you then look at to what extent are equivalents available in the different context. And we hypothesized, for example, that something like CVA will work very differently in certain kinds of fragile context or where governments are non-supportive. But I'll actually give an example of that from the Realist Review presentation in a minute. It's a totally different approach to accumulation than some qualitative approaches which assume that nothing is portable. We assume that understanding on the basis of context, mechanism, outcome, it's the understanding that's portable, and then you tailor the program according to the understanding, including the understanding of what matters about context. You might need to... Sorry, John, quickly, yeah?
Yeah, I did a quick follow-up on the last two questions. That some of the important things you're learning are very specific to the context, and it would be very, very valuable to learn that and act on it very early on in the program rather than after it's been running for 6 months or a year or 2 years. Are people seeing the value of that opportunity?
Yes, to some extent. It's often difficult to get that depth of understanding early on in a program. I mean, programs are usually still at the setup stage at 6 months, and it's too early to be getting the kinds of outcomes. And without the outcomes, it's hard to work out what the causal processes are. It's possible to do kind of realist process evaluation as you go through a pilot stage of a program, but there are some levels of understanding that you can't get too early in the process. So the understanding does build over time, and you kind of have to accept that that's the nature of reality. You know, you can't know everything at once right from the beginning. It can be, the same approach can be used for program planning, and I know that's one of your questions, but we'll come back to it after we've done some work about realist review, I think. Okay, with apologies to anybody else who was wanting to ask a question, if we could ask you to hold it to the end. I just want to do a super quick whiz through of the process of realist review. I know that this is of significance to some people who are going to be involved in trying to do some realist review work for the movement, and so want to have a little quick chat about that. So the overview slide is to say, well, what is it that makes a realist review be realist as compared to being any other kind of review? And just as a passing aside, there are something like 30 different approaches to doing literature review and evidence synthesis, and they all make different assumptions, etc., etc. So what makes a realist review realist is that it is based in realist philosophy, and that influences everything, including the role of the researcher. The researcher doing the review is seen to be part of the resource that is available in producing the review results, and we are supposed to be engaged in it, and we are supposed to be thinking, and we are supposed to be coming up with ideas, which is quite different from the kind of objective stand aside, you're not supposed to influence this at all approach that underpins some other kinds of approaches. The type of question that you ask in a realist review, or questions, is going to be a realist question. It's going to be about how, for whom, in what context, why, etc., etc. The focus of a realist review is on the program theory, not the program itself. So in that last evaluation of CVA in that particular program, we ended up with program theory that is about how that particular social accountability program strengthens systems. So if we were to then pick up and do a realist review about that, we would ask something about how and in what contexts do social accountability programs strengthen systems, rather than asking how does CVA strengthen systems, or what is it about social accountability mechanism, social accountability strategies that fires different kinds of empowerment mechanisms for different players in the system, or whatever. So you're focusing in on the theory, not a specific program. The search strategy is different. You develop your search strategy as you're going through the process of developing the theory that you're looking at and working out which bits of the theory that you're going to focus on in your review. In other kinds of reviews, you work out some search terms at the beginning, you run your search strategy at the beginning, and then you don't repeat that throughout. Whereas for realist review, it's much more iterative. As you discover something really interesting, you might need to run a little mini search and go off and investigate something on the side that then fits into your overall analysis. The selection of the text that you include and exclude is different for realist review, because you're selecting them for their relevance to the program theory. You're not selecting them on the basis of the method that was used for the evaluation. And that's what's done, for example, in Cochrane reviews in the health sector, where they say we only include experimental and quasi-experimental designs. Realist reviews do not exclude on the basis of study design. You exclude most of the interesting data if you do. And it's not selected for the particular intervention. In my PhD, I did a mini realist review as one chapter, and one of the things that I was investigating was about attachment theory and parenting and how that affects child development. One of the texts that I used was a research study about Israeli soldiers in the course of war. What's that got to do with parenting style? Well, it's got to do with attachment style and how people respond to stress. No other form of review would enable you to investigate the piece of research that tells you about how high levels of stress affect attachment responses in such a way that those responses might then go on and influence parenting and therefore child development. The way we assess the quality of the texts is different in Realist Review. We acknowledge that we don't necessarily need to assess the whole study against any overall set of standards. What we do is assess the quality of the bits that we are going to use in the review and ask the question, are the methods underpinning this particular bit that we're using adequate to support the judgment that has been made in that text or the judgment that we are going to make in the review? The nature of the synthesis is different in a Realist review. We're not aggregating the results and saying on average the effect size is 7%. We are trying to refine and synthesize the theory. And the product is not an answer. It's not a judgment about these programs work to this level. It's an improved theory that can be used in different ways by different people in different circumstances, but most notably is intended to improve policy and programs in areas related to the piece of program theory that you're investigating. The technical sequence that you go through in order to run a Realist review is you do a bit of a quick initial search to work out what it is the overall program theory is about. And so Ray Pawson is responsible for the terms in quote marks at the end here. He calls it eliciting the theory that you are going to investigate. Then you select which questions you're going to answer. There's always many different aspects of a theory that you could investigate. You can never investigate all of them, so you've got to develop questions for the particular bits of theory that you're going to select. You then search for studies that are best placed to test that bit of theory that you're going to test, and you appraise the quality of those studies for their potential to help you test and refine the theory that you're trying to refine. Now, what that means is that you can't have a standard matrix that you extract the data from, and from all studies, as they do in a system meta-analytic review, like a Cochrane review. You pull out certain aspects of information from each study. What was the net effect size, etc., etc. But we're selecting different bits of data from different kinds of studies to test different bits of the program theory that we are trying to understand. So we need to extract different data for that. The process of synthesis is different, as I already mentioned. And then what it is that you disseminate afterwards is the refined middle range theory that is portable to some extent across contexts or programs. And the role of the reviewer is, as I said, different. The role of the reviewer is that you are there to refine the theory. And what that means is that reporting accurately, which is harder than it sounds, exactly what it is that has been found in the different studies that you're looking at is absolutely essential, but it's not enough. You have to be able to contribute to this process yourself. And that requires a whole set of judgments of many different kinds on an ongoing basis while you go through the process of doing your review. And so you can't design your review at the beginning and then give it to your PhD student, as we talk about in academics. To do it, you actually have to be involved, and it requires analysis and an original contribution by the researcher to do, or researchers plural, to do a good quality Realist review. So I'm going to whiz through my example. This again is a social accountability example, deliberately chosen so that I've given you one evaluation and one review on a related topic. This one was done for DFID in the UK, and the question that we were trying to answer was, under what circumstances does enhancing community accountability and empowerment improve education outcomes, particularly for the poor? far too big a question, just by the way. learn from my mistakes. So the first thing that we had to look at was, well, what are the different kinds of approaches, strategies, policies that governments in these 100 possible low and middle income countries might be using that might somehow contribute to community accountability and empowerment. So the first step was to build this little model saying these are the kinds that that exist, and this is where our focus is going to be. We developed our initial rough theory by doing a quick scan of some existing literature and looking at existing program theories and asking ourselves, what are the key ideas and what's the existing state of theory here? And the bits that we pulled out from existing literature in our first initial scan related to accountability and to empowerment, because those were the key things in the question. And we found stuff about the long and short routes to accountability, and we found stuff about transparency, answerability, enforceability, and sanction as being key aspects of what are required for accountability. And we found stuff about empowerment being both a process and an outcome, and being both individual and collective. And then we found, or no, we didn't find, I already knew about it, but we decided to use Friedman's empowerment model as our starting point for our theoretical work around empowerment. And then we proceeded to develop a series of diagrams that track the kinds of activities and resources that are provided in these initiatives and the responses that they generate and the intended outcomes. I'm not going to show you those, they're long and detailed. Then, of course, we had to do our literature search once we had our program theories. And as I said, it's not all done at the beginning. And you don't just use search terms, you use snowballing. So that's looking at the references in the first lot of literature that you've got to see what else has been written about this, and searching for citations of that literature since it was published, and tracing authors who are working on particular subjects of interest. And it can be all kinds of literature that is used. It can be research, it can be evaluation reports, it can be articles, it can be conference presentations, or whatever. There are limitations to the way you can use some kinds of evidence, but that's a level of detail we can't go into today. And so what we did, which was much more work than I would recommend now, is we did an initial scoping search. We actually did do a traditional systematic review search, but we did it for a particular purpose. We wanted to find out what proportion of our evidence came from that original search. And we did website searches, and we did all the snowballing techniques, and we also sent out a request for, do you know about any other evidence, to our end user group. So when we were then going through how do we work out what to include, the key inclusion criteria for a realist review are relevance and rigor. And relevance means relevance to the theory. So first of all, we included or excluded on the basis of titles. Some things were clearly not relevant. Then for things where there were still questions, we read the abstracts. And then when we still couldn't tell from the abstract, we read either the executive summary or the of a report, or an introduction and conclusion to an article. And that was the basis on which we decided to include or exclude. Rigor means, as I said before, is it good enough quality to support the particular inference that we're using? That meant making judgments along the way about the specific findings in relation to the specific inference that we wanted to use. And there is a question about whether or not you can use overall quality assessment tools appropriate to the type of study. There's a whole range of tools available to do that. But normally we would say, don't assess the whole study. You might not be using the whole study. Through our process of review, we identified a total of 11 mechanisms, and each one was written up as a little paragraph. But these are about 6 or something, or 7 of the 11 that we identified. And I'm not going to go through them all in detail now, but you will see that they're not about program activity per se. They're about how and why program activities enable change. So the eyes and ears ones we are going to talk about a little bit, and that's where community members are acting as eyes and ears for the government in this case, acting as local data collectors, forwarding the information that they collect to somebody who has the authority to act in response to the findings. And the outcome of the eyes and ears mechanism is the action that is taken by that third party who's got the authority to act. You can have a look at some of those others if you want. And this review is available online if anybody's really seriously interested. Now, what is it that makes that eyes and ears thing act? Well, first of all, the data is comprehensive because it's collected across the whole program area, and it's verifiable, so it can be checked for accuracy. And the party who is receiving the information has the authority to act on it. So those words in bold print there are about the mechanism, the what is it that makes this work. And then we had multiple examples that we included in the report. For example, in a Philippines textbook watch program, what the local monitors actually did was check the title of the books to make sure the right books were arriving, the number of the books, did we get as many as we should, and the quality of the books, which was pretty rough and ready quality assessment. They picked them up and shook them to see whether or not the pages fell out and whether or not the print quality was good enough to be read. And what happened, the action by the authority was that the education department wouldn't pay the printer for the books unless the right number and quality had been received. Different example in rural India, a non-government organisation running non-formal education centres, think education up to about year 8, 1 teacher per school, provided a camera to the teachers. The problem here is that teachers weren't attending as often as they should. And so a student was required to take a photograph of the teacher in the class at the start and the end of each day. The time and date stamps on the photo act as the proof that the teacher was actually there. And for the first time, the action by the authority holder, for the very first time, the teacher's pay was directly related to their attendance. Don't turn up to work, don't get paid. As well as the 11 mechanisms that we identified, we also identified 30 different elements of context in 13 different categories. And we have evidence in relation to each of them in the report. Consequently, it's quite a long report. But what I want to do now, just to provide an example, is pick up one aspect of capacities of local communities that turned out to be important to whether or not these social accountability works initiatives improved education outcomes. And the one aspect of capacity that I'm going to pick up on is adult literacy. So we're talking here about parents. So we discovered evidence to say that where the parents were not themselves literate in the language in use in the particular country, that made it more difficult for them to contribute to administering or managing schools, for example, by being on the school council. It made them less confident to challenge teachers or to monitor teachers. Parents that said things like, who am I to challenge her? She is an educated woman. It made it harder for them to assess their own child's learning. And if they couldn't assess whether or not their kid was doing well at school, they were less likely to act to hold the school accountable. And so over in the right-hand box, we find little skerricks of evidence that support this issue about if they can't assess their own child's learning, that makes them less likely to act, which I won't go through in detail now, but we discovered that there was significant reason to believe that parents couldn't necessarily assess whether or not their child was learning or the school was doing well. So we had this incredibly detailed and nuanced set of information about the mechanisms and the features of context that affect those mechanisms. How do you make all of that useful to policy and program people? Well, the first thing that we did was put together these CMO tables. Now, if you just look at the first one, the example of the eyes and ears mechanism that we talked about a minute ago, where the citizens are collecting the data, if you have a supportive political context where the government is a partner in the accountability intervention and the performance is something that can easily be observed and reported, like are the right textbooks here and are they okay, then you get outcomes like reduction in corruption and the resources that are required actually being able to be actually being available to be used locally and to contribute to the quality of education. But if you don't have a supportive political context, but it's not a terrifying political context, you're not going to get shot for speaking up, then what if you also can get fairly widespread community mobilization, and again about something that is relatively easy to observe, what the outcome that you get then is more likely to be civil campaigns for rights and entitlements to be met. And that's a different form of putting pressure on a government. So that's the example I was talking about earlier about you might have the same mechanism, but you need to understand whether and how it can fire in different kinds of contexts. So that was one of the things that we did to make the data comprehensible. The next thing that we did was work out which kinds of mechanisms were most likely to operate in which of those categories of intervention that we'd worked out right back at the beginning. And we were able to say that some mechanisms some interventions enable quite a range of mechanisms to operate, but others have a much more limited range of mechanisms that might operate as a result. And of course, if you're trying to work out which policy or program to introduce, knowing how they might operate may help inform that decision. And then the third thing that we did was produce tables that enabled people to see what it is about the what you do that needs to be right in order for the mechanism to actually fire. And of course, this is the bit that people have the power to influence. It's about the interventions themselves. So what are the necessary features of the intervention for the eyes and ears mechanism to operate? And what we did here was describe things about the intervention itself and then provide examples of it so that people could look back into the more detailed examples earlier in the report if they wished. So that was things that we did in the reporting that were designed to enable people to use the report to inform policies and programs. We actually provided three different kinds of reports, but I'm going to pause there or in fact finish there and invite any further questions or comments that people have before we wind up, or as winding up.
Jill, there was a question that John had raised with you at the beginning in terms of concurrent, and I was wondering if you want to tackle that because we are over time, so people may have to leave as well. But
yeah, my apologies for the overtime. Very quickly, John had previously asked whether or not you can use these same approaches for program planning, and the answer is yes, you can. You basically go through the same kinds of processes. So you start by thinking about what is it that we're thinking of doing and why, what's our purpose? So what are we trying to achieve? What do we think we might be doing that will help us to achieve that? Then why do we think that will work? And what needs to be present in the context for that to work? And are all those things actually there already, or do we need to do things to prepare the context before we can implement the kind of intervention that we want to develop? I was just starting to say to John before we started the session that working through that process with a program that's in its relatively early stages of development often results in people identifying that they've missed out a whole section of planning. Some organisations have relatively standard interventions that they run in different kinds of contexts. You can use a very similar process to say, once you understand or have some initial theory about what the context and mechanism need to be, you can then start to say, well, how might we need to tweak our intervention or redesign our intervention in order for it to work in this particular set of circumstances? So the underpinning logic is the same, it's just being applied at a different stage, and the outcome is immediate tweaking or redesign of your program. And then you design your evaluation to monitor exactly, to keep an eye on, not monitor in the formal sense, keep an eye on whether or not things are happening as you expected them to happen, and to tailor your intervention on an ongoing basis.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. So Colin had a question. What's the time investment required for a realist evaluation?
Yeah, it's a very good question, which, like all evaluations, it can be scaled up and scaled down. It depends on the type of design. Are you doing it concurrently or retrospectively? It depends on the kinds of questions that you're asking. It depends on the resources available. You know, if you don't have the resources that you would like to have, then you can scale down the design. It's better to do a little bit well than it is to try and do too much and do it badly. I have done realist informed retrospective evaluations in 3 or 4 months with 1 or 2 people, knowing however that was me that was me doing it, and I've got a relatively high level of expertise in realist approaches. I've also done these, you know, comprehensive 4-year 60,000, it wasn't 60,000, it was $90,000 over 4 years, with a few additional resources that we chipped in as well, evaluations. So a lot depends how much it costs. A lot depends on the level of expertise and also whether it's participatory or not. The only reason we could do that Indonesia evaluation for 90K was that the staff in the intervention were actually doing all the data collection rather than us, and they were either translating or organising the translation of the qualitative data for us so that we could work in English, because I don't speak Bahasa. And the data was actually being collected in multiple languages and then translated back. So an awful lot, it's a how long is a piece of string question. An awful lot depends on the circumstances that you're working in and the questions that you're trying to answer. Some people argue that realist evaluation is necessarily more expensive. I don't believe that to be true. I think what it is that you have to spend a bit more of your available resource up front to be able to get your design right and to know what kinds of data you need and what kinds of analyses you're going to do. But then you're going to collect data for any kind of evaluation. You're going to have to analyze it for any kind of evaluation. So I don't think it's necessarily more expensive if you've got the expertise in the team to do it.
So I realize we are 7 minutes over time already. Unless somebody has any other pressing questions, what I'll do is I will circulate both the recording of this webinar alongside Jill's slides. And yeah, so any more final questions? I guess not.
Nothing here.
Jill,
Thanks so
thank
much,
you.
Jill. This was great.
Thanks, Matthew. My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. This has been amazing, and thank you for taking out the time and doing this for us. There were a lot of people who could not join from Asia and Africa, like I told you earlier, because of the time zones, but who will see the recording, and we will probably have a process of collating some questions and sending them across to you if they come from people.
Yep, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, thank you everybody very much for your attendance at whatever horrible time of day it was for you, day, night, morning. And I'll look forward to working with some of you later on in other ways, I hope.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
I'll hang up for now. Gunjan, thanks very much for organising.
Thanks, Jill. Bye, everyone, and hope to see you all soon in some of the subgroup meetings.
Yes.
Have a
Bye.
great day.
Bye.
Bye.